There's growing public anger in Cuba. The government's being blamed for the economic collapse, and people want more freedom. They're also calling for the current leadership to step down. So where does this leave the Communist Party in Havana? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Sohail Rahman. Food and medicine shortages, electricity blackouts and a surge in coronavirus cases. Cuba's worsening living conditions have sparked the island nation's largest protests in decades. Many Cubans say that they've had enough of government policies and have taken to the streets demanding the president step down. They're also calling for more freedom and are using slogans against the ruling Communist Party. Dozens of people have been arrested in a crackdown on security forces. Activists are using social media to gather support, but there are now restrictions for internet access. President Miguel Diaz-Canel, who succeeded Raul Castro this year, called on his supporters to defend the country. He's blamed the turmoil on decades-long US sanctions, which have dried up cash resources.
The lack of finance for governance is due to the aggressive policy of blockade and financial persecution by the US. It's being maintained by the government, and we have not been able to maintain and fix the power supply plan.
Now, the US administration during Donald Trump's tenure imposed more than 200 new sanctions on Cuba, and President Joe Biden has so far left those measures in place. He's urged the Cuban government to listen to people's grievances.
Folks, I want to start by recognizing the remarkable protests that are taking place in Cuba. With the Cuban people demanding their freedom from an authoritarian regime. And I don't think we've seen anything like this protest in a long, long time, if quite frankly ever. The United States stands firmly with the people of Cuba as they assert their universal rights. And we call on the government of Cuba to refrain from violence or attempts to silence the voice of the people of Cuba.
Well, Cuba has been suffering hardship since the collapse of its backer, the Soviet Union. It's now facing the gravest economic crisis in more than 30 years. The economy shrank by 11% last year, and it's believed to be far worse now. Tourism revenues, a main source of income for many Cubans, have dried up. The number of international travellers fell to nearly 90% compared to the year before. Cubans wait in line for hours to buy basic products, pharmacy shelves are empty and electricity blackouts are common. The price of goods has also soared, with inflation at 500% and expected to increase further. The government's reserves of foreign currency are depleted and it cannot afford to buy in goods to make up for the shortages. Well, let's bring in our guest. Joining me via Zoom from Havana in Cuba is Gregory Biniowsky, a Cuba analyst and strategic consultant. From Miami, Florida in the United States, Rosa María, Payá, founder of CubaDecide, a pro-democracy movement, and the executive director of the Foundation for Pan-American Democracy. And in Ottawa, the Canadian capital, Klepak, author of the book Cuba's Military, 1990 to 2005, and a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada. A warm welcome to all of my guests, and thanks for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Mr. Biniowsky, because you're in Havana, I'd just like to know, anger on the streets of Cuba. Many might not have thought they would have ever seen the scenes that they did. And how surprised then are you about what you've seen, certainly from Sunday onwards?
In fact, if I'm surprised, is that these signs of anger and discontent hadn't manifested months earlier. The situation in Cuba has been extremely critical for many months now, and it's, if anything, surprising. It's the population's patience with the regime, and until last Sunday, holding back in mass protest.
Ms. Payá, in Miami, let me bring you in. You have a different view, perhaps, and a different perspective, being across the water. What surprised you about Sunday, or did it surprise you at all?
No, it was not. It was not a surprise. Actually, from the beginning of the year till June 30, there were more than 1,100 protests that we know of. So the conditions were created for this to happen. It's something is surprising is that these massive way to go to the streets didn't happen before. We registered on Sunday more than 45 between cities and towns that were protesting. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of Cubans in the street at the same time across the island, demanding freedom, demanding the end of the dictatorship.
Mr. Klepak, in Ottawa, was this just, you might say, a pressure cooker just waiting to burst?
Yes, I have to agree with Gregory entirely. I think this was not the only surprise here is the time that it took before there was an explosion of some kind or other. The suffering that your program is underscoring is absolutely accurate. Cubans are going through the worst period, perhaps a worse period even than the special period of the 1990s, where things were pretty bad. But at the moment, there are other elements, such as the tightening of the blockade or the embargo, which have simply sent the already terribly difficult situation of the longest economic war in history through the roof.
Indeed, and we'll unpick that as the programme develops. Can I bring in Gregory again in Havana? I mean, how concerned were you when you started to hear reports about the heavy-handedness of the security forces? The authorities on the island have tried to hold back over the last 6 decades when it comes to protests like this.
For the moment, I wasn't that concerned, perturbed. Any kind of hindrance of public protest, of course, is disturbing. I would also say, though, that compared to protests around the world, the Cuban military has shown considerable restraint. I mean, there are no serious injuries that have been reported by the mainstream media, definitely no deaths. And I know I have friends that were part of the protests, and they themselves said that they weren't happy with it, but they were not allowed to protest in a way that, again, compared to protests throughout Latin America, if we're looking at Colombia or Chile, where you had 800 people losing their eyes because of rubber bullets, Cuba's reaction was quite restrained. Okay. That does not justify stopping it, but I think we need to note the difference.
Ms. Payá, I was watching you as Gregory spoke. You were shaking your head in perhaps disagreement. Would you like to come in?
Yes, of course, because maybe it's because of the disinformation, maybe it's because of the shutdown of internet that happened from Sunday in the island, that the right amount of information is not available. But I invite you to check social media and to see, for instance, the reports that in Santiago de Cuba, just in the city of Santiago de Cuba, have been 5 persons assassinated. We have a list of at least 80 names which are missing, detained and missing. These 80 names are, of course, partial, are the names of the principal leaders of the opposition, the principal leaders of the Cuban civil society. But these protests are citizen-led protests and that have been transversal in the whole island. They have been, I just saw yesterday night an image, a video of a lady crying and screaming because his nephew was killed in the street, beaten by the special bodies of the Minister of Interior that are in the whole island, actually spreading violence against the people that is protesting in the street.
OK, so we set the scene about what's happened since Sunday. So let's just try and unpick exactly how we've got here. Mr. Klepak in Ottawa, I mean, the government's problems, as you mentioned, the embargo, the sanctions. We had the global financial crashes of, the 1980s and the 2000s. Cuba seemed to survive through all of those 6 decades of, you might say, turmoil, plus the Soviet breakup and very little domestic strife with that. Why has it boiled over, do you think, now? Is there another reason?
Well, I think it's just that combination of factors that this has sustained months and months of problems that have not been known before, even in the special period in many areas. There are areas where that's not true. Public transport is still functioning, and by special period standards, electricity is still functioning reasonably. But the queues in the streets are simply unbelievable. And the difficulties with inflation and the fact that remittances are cut so severely, particularly from the United States, but even internationally, given the economic downturn generally. And when you add to that the tremendous success of Cuban medicine and the Cuban health system in the early months, now overturned in recent weeks by the explosion of the pandemic. Really, it is an extraordinary combination, which I think has meant that for perhaps the first time, there's a real generalized loss of confidence in whether the government has control of the situation in terms of being able to pull out Cuba from its current crisis.
Mr. Biniowsky in Havana, you seem to be nodding in agreement with that. I mean, you're on the ground there. You speak to people all the time. How do they feel about where they are now and who's to blame?
Yeah. Well, I think that it's an error to look at the Cuban crisis in a black and white way. I think there is a significant minority of people in Cuba who want to see regime collapse. I think there is a significant minority of people who are blindly loyal to the regime. And I think there is a majority of people in the middle who all want significant economic reform, but do not want tumultuous collapse. And I think, at least the Cubans that I speak to, including Cubans who are not members of the Communist Party and sympathetic to the government, they would prefer change within the system because they're fearful of collapse. So I think that what do the protests mean? People are fed up, but I do not necessarily think that means the vast majority of Cubans want a collapse, a precipitous collapse of the regime.
No, Ms. Payá, I saw you with a wry smile listening to what Gregory had to say, because I just wonder whether the assumption that people don't want to leave the island, they love their Cuba, they love their country, but they just want a change of leadership and direction that would take them out of what they've seen as 6 decades of sanctions, 6 decades of a blockade. I mean, is there a happy medium at all?
Well, everybody is entitled to their assumptions and their opinions. But what the people was screaming in the streets was freedom, down with the dictatorship. I'm not inventing this. I'm just repeating what we listened to what we listened on Sunday and even on Monday. And they just told me today that in Camagüey there are still protests even. Beside all the repression that have been taking place in the island. The people was chanting homeland and life, which in Spanish is patria y vida. The people was chanting freedom, 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 down with the dictatorship. I think that that's pretty clear. And my call and my suggestion for the international community and for all those people with good intentions and as those that constitute this panel is please to listen to the people and not so much to hold the propaganda of the regime, all the symbolism that the Cuban dictatorship have been able to build during the last decades. Okay. And please listen to the people. That is just very tired and is saying enough.
Gregory, Gregory's disagreeing with you, but I'll come back to you, Gregory, in a moment. I just want to go to Mr. Klepak, because if you have a disagreement and you want down with the regime, as Ms. Payá is saying, many supporters want to see in Cuba, Mr. Klepak, what replaces it and who replaces it and from where?
Well, I think that's really the key question, and the government has been able to take advantage of this for some time. Cubans are remarkably well educated, particularly since the revolution, and Gregory is absolutely right that there are significant portions of the population that are still very loyal, not to mention the armed forces and the reserve forces. This is not a black and white situation. Cuba rarely is. Human affairs rarely are. I think that what we see is an increasing frustration, an explosion of that frustration. I think that historically, what is the problem? Every time there is a collapse of a system in Cuba, it leads to either civil war, United States intervention, or both. And very, very few people want to go down that route. I speak every day with people from across the country, mostly in the academic sphere, so perhaps a bit separated from some elements, but there is not a feeling, in my view, of a vast majority of insurrection-style call for the total dismantlement of a system which has remarkable achievements in a Latin American context. And I think that is the problem. How would you replace this? What do you move in? There's general rejection of the Miami option of going back to 1958. There's general rejection of carrying on as one has been carrying on for the last 60 years because it's not any longer producing the goods. So I think that is the crisis in Cuban people on the island, in my mind. They do not wish to see catastrophe and blood in the streets, but neither do they wish the continuation of what they see as a government which doesn't produce what they needed.
Indeed. It seems agreement and disagreement, certainly in the nodding heads I'm getting. But Gregory Biniowsky, let me come back to you. Nodding in agreement with what Mr. Klepak says. But obviously the US themselves are sort of voicing their concern. And it's not necessarily that Cuban people want a US style of democracy. They've seen what US intentions can do in other countries, and it's not great when it comes to what the world thinks democracy should be. Where should the debate begin? If it's not in Miami and if it's not in Cuba, where should it begin?
I believe the debate needs to take place first and foremost between the Cuban government and the American government to lift the embargo. I think that the keeping the embargo in place and the incredible disappointment here in Cuba by people across the political spectrum that Biden did not quickly return to Obama's policy of engagement. That is the key thing. Lift the embargo first, and then if Cuba does not change, there is a different argument to be made. But I think the international community is very, very clear that the embargo has no moral basis and should be lifted. And I would like to pose the question to Ms. Payá. Does she also think that the U.S. embargo be lifted immediately and unconditionally, and then allow Cubans on the island and Cubans in Miami through dialogue to make changes? Because the remaining of the embargo maintains a fortress mentality and, in fact, empowers hardline tendencies in the government and weakens reformist tendencies. I would like to know, Ms. Payá, should the embargo be lifted?
Ms. Payá, the floor is yours.
That's your opinion. The people on the street is not asking for the lifting of the embargo. It's asking for the end of the dictatorship. And there is and the real conflict here is not between Cuba and any other country. The real conflict here is between a dictatorship that for 62 years have been repressing the Cuban people, kidnapping the human rights, and that have put our beautiful island into a deeper, very, very deep and very dark crisis. And the people in the streets is saying, we're able to save our country, but we need the end of the dictatorship. We need to freedom to do it. And it's actually very frustrating to listen to foreign people that I believe that love the Cuban people to put the conflict in other dimension that is not the principal one. We do not need any negotiation between the dictatorship and any other government. Okay, we are able to speak for ourselves. And what we need to do that is freedom, and it is the support of the free world for that freedom that the people were demanding in the streets.
Gregory, you want to come back on that?
Yeah, the vast majority of Cubans, and this has been shown in many, many polling instances, the vast majority of Cubans do not support the U.S. embargo. Again, I would like Ms. Payá to respond. What does she think? But moreover, tens of thousands, let's say even hundreds of thousands of people in the street is not necessarily people. Cuba is a country of 12 million people. So if you can get 100,000 on the street, what about the rest of the population? I would say they want the embargo lifted. I would say they definitely want fundamental economic change and eventually political change. But I think they want it done in a very slow, paused, and secure way. Again, lift the U.S. embargo. This is obviously intervention in the sovereignty of the country. And if it wasn't, why does every other country in the world say the embargo should be lifted? I've spoken to Western diplomats who say the embargo hinders change in Cuba. So if Ms. Payá and others want change in Cuba, I think they should say, I think here's an opportunity for her to say publicly, I would like the Biden administration to immediately return to the position of Obama and proceed by lifting the embargo. I would like Ms. Payá to say that, because I would say, and I'm here in Havana, the vast majority of Cubans want the embargo lifted today.
Ms. Payá?
Well, the vast majorities of Cubans on the streets were asking for freedom and for the end of the dictatorship. And I'm a human rights defender, and human rights have been kidnapped by the Cuban dictatorship for 62 years in my country. And to keep making this conversation about Congress of the United States and not about the main conflict that is taking place today in my country, which is a conflict between a dictatorship with a military power cracking down on unarmed and peaceful protests that were asking for freedom. Well, I think that that's all that the regime wants. Of course, you just heard what Diaz-Canel was saying. He was not talking about the demand for freedom of the Cuban people. He was talking about the topic that he wants to talk. Other countries doing other sins. We are talking about Cubans, and this is among Cubans. And Cubans should be the protagonist role in this conflict, because we are the most affected, and we are the ones that are asking for freedom. And all that we need is solidarity for the international community with that very simple demand.
Okay, Ms. Payá, let's go over to Ottawa and to Mr. Klepak there, because obviously we wonder, with all of the disturbances on the streets, with the international condemnation that's come with it, how serious or how precarious is President Miguel Diaz-Canel's position right now? How do you view it?
Well, I think it's very dangerous to start speaking in these black and white terms. There is a crisis. There is an explosion of ire among a large percentage of the Cuban people, and frustration among the whole of the Cuban people. But to put this in black and white terms of dictatorship against people is really not very helpful, and doesn't reflect in any way the last 62 years of the experience of the island. As a historian, I'm baffled by this black and whiteness. What we have is a real problem, a real issue at the moment, and we want to advance in human rights in democratic terms. How would you do that? Well, you have to have dialogue or violence, and the idea that this is going to be the people rising as one against this government, and that therefore it's just going to topple, is simply not on. Well, it's not going to work that way.
Then, Mr. Klepak, can I come in there? Mr. Klepak, can I come in there? Because it seems that President Canel, or Diaz-Canel, doesn't want to have that dialogue right now at the moment. He's just blaming America for everything that's going on in his island and on his island. So at what stage can there be any dialogue? And who makes the first move? You know, if Biden's government in the US has maintained the position from his predecessor, how do you move the line to start a negotiation?
Yes, I think that's a very fair question. And of course, they have done what they always do, which is blame uniquely the United States. This is the longest economic warfare in history between a superpower and a tiny country. There's no doubt that the impact, particularly for access to international credit, has been a crippling problem for the Cuban state for the last 62 years. But that doesn't mean that by simply saying that they're the only problem, when your own administration has been inefficient, it's been incompetent on many levels, and while there are many, many achievements which are extraordinary in any terms, at the same time, at the moment, we see more failure than positive things, to say the least. So he has to open himself up to dialogue with a wider spectrum of the population. But as long as Gregory was saying, as long as the embargo is in place, it's extremely difficult to see how one can move forward, because there will be no resources, and the temptation to use the mano dura to suppress dissent will be very strong.
It's obviously a subject that we will have to revisit. Unfortunately, we have run out of time there, and I think that we will be coming to this story again and again. I'd like to thank all of my guests for joining me on this edition of Inside Story, to Gregory Biniowsky, Rosa, María, Payá and Raul Castro. Thanks so much. And of course, thank you for watching. You, of course, can see this programme again by logging on to our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sohail, Rahman and the Inside Story team, thanks very much for your time and your company.